Welcome back to Giant Monster Games! I'm Adrian, and today we are doing a deck called Death and Taxes. It is commonly referred to also as Hatebears and Eldrazi and Taxes, depending if you're playing the Eldrazi version of this deck. We are not. We are playing just the regular old Death and Taxes version of the deck, so I'm going to break that down for you guys on what exactly is a Death and Taxes deck. But before I do that, don't forget to comment on this video, subscribe to Giant Monster Games if you like this content and want to see more of it, and go over to Flipside Gaming and use promo code Giant Monster Games to save 10% on your online purchase. So what exactly is a Death and Taxes deck? Because Death and Taxes are the only two things that are guaranteed in life, at least according to the saying, but that's not exactly what this deck is about. This deck is about making it so your opponent has to do extra stuff in order to actually get what they want to do. So what do we actually have? Let's talk about the taxes part of this deck before we actually get into the death part of this deck. So to start out with, we are running Aven Mindcensor and Leonin Arbiter. So both of these cards are really the epitomizing idea of what this deck is doing. We're running 4 of both of these if you didn't actually guess that already, is they are making it so if our opponent wants to search their deck, they're going to have to jump through some extra hoops, which is super duper important for us. So Leonin Arbiter, to be specific, is players can't search libraries. Players may pay 2 mana to ignore this effect. Aven Mindcensor, on the other hand, is if an opponent, not us, would search their library, that player searches the top 4 cards of their library instead. So they are only going to be looking 4 cards deep for whatever they're looking for. So these cards stop almost anything that is going to be searching up cards. So I'm thinking really specifically here of fetch lands becoming a huge one, and a lot of cards that allow your opponent to tutor up stuff, which is super duper important. Now we're not just playing these cards, we're playing cards that give us extreme value off these cards. I'm thinking specifically of cards like Ghost Quarter and Path to Exile, which we're running 4 of both of these cards because they are way too good not to be playing, because Ghost Quarter is we tap it, sacrifice it, destroy target land, and then our opponent gets to go and fetch up a new land. So normally we go down on a land and our opponent just kind of stays flat on the number of lands they have, but they get rid of maybe a special land they have. In this case, we actually get rid of our own land, and we also get rid of their land. It is literally a wasteland. It is destroying their land and our land. And then Path to Exile, which is really a key component of this deck, which is unfortunately where most of the money of this deck is actually going right now, because this is $7 a card, at least at the filming of this video, so it is a little expensive. But Path to Exile does exile target creature. Its controller may search their library for a basic land, put that card into the battlefield tapped, then shuffle their library. In this case, our opponent does not get to actually go and fetch up that land unless they're going to pay 2 mana for Leonin Arbiter, or they're only going to search 4 cards deep if we have an Aven Mindcensor in place. So with Modern, this is a huge deal. Exiling a creature for 1 mana is crazy. So both of these cards are going to give us a ton of value once we have Leonin Arbiter or Aven Mindcensor in play. Now, it's kind of hard to say that this deck is taxing our opponent without a bunch of other cards that are also going to be doing taxing on our opponent. Specifically, we are running things like 4 copies of Dryad Militant, 4 copies of Spirit of the Labyrinth, and 3 copies of Vryn Wingmare. So these cards are just taxing our opponent even more. So Dryad Militant is whenever an instant or sorcery will be put into a graveyard, exile that card instead. So this helps us shut down a lot of dredge decks, it helps us shut down storm decks, it helps us shut down most anything that is running Snapcaster Mage. It really slows down a lot of decks. Additionally, this is also a 2-1 for 1, which is really one of the reasons why we're running it as well, because it is just an early game beater. Spirit of the Labyrinth makes it so players can only draw 1 card each turn, so this shuts down a ton of decks. Like Storm dies to this, a lot of blue decks die to this. There's a ton of decks out there that rely on getting a little bit of extra card draw just so they can actually accelerate and get the advantage in the game. This is really slowing down most of those decks' tempo because they're not drawing that extra card. Something to keep in mind though is that with this card, we can actually draw cards on our opponent's turn, because we do have a bunch of cards that are going to allow us to draw and get card advantage as well, and luckily for us, we can be doing those on our opponent's turn, which is actually pretty good. And lastly, Vryn Wingmare, which is a flying creature that has 2/1, which is fantastic, but that's not what's relevant about it. What it is non-creature spells cost 1 additional mana to cast, which really slows down a ton of decks, because almost everything needs to be playing with an additional 1 mana in mind. So a lot of decks that would normally rely on being able to go off with the exact amount of mana they need, so we're talking about eggs, we're talking about ad nauseum, there's a ton of decks out there that really rely on, this is exactly how much mana I need to win the game, and this is exactly how much mana I can produce, where this card basically kills them in their tracks. Unfortunately, it is a 3-drop, and we already have a lot of 3-drops, so we're only running 2 of these guys because there are other cards we need to be running instead. Now, something you may have noticed with all of these cards is they have at least 2 or 3 power, which means we can be swinging in and doing a little bit of damage with these cards, and this is actually how we're actually going to be winning the game. But if we do need to actually close out the game faster, we do have a bunch of cards that are the death section of this deck, so let's actually talk about the death section of this deck. Well, to start out with, we have actually 2 cards that are doing something very specific in this deck, and that is Thraben Inspector and Blade Splicer. We're running 4 of both of these cards because they are extremely large key components of the deck. Thraben Inspector is whenever it comes into play, we get to investigate, which means we get an artifact that we can sacrifice and draw a card with. The good thing about this artifact is we can actually use this to draw the card on our opponent's turn if we do have Spirit of the Labyrinth in place, which means we're not completely losing our draw engine here because we can do this on our opponent's turn, and realistically, we want to do this on our opponent's end step anyways, so it's not actually that bad. Blade Splicer, on the other hand, is really part of the death part of this deck, because whenever it enters the battlefield, we get to create a 3/3 colorless Golem artifact token, which, as long as we have a Blade Splicer in play, has first strike. So swinging in with a 3/3 first strike every single turn is going to be really insanely hard for our opponent to deal with. Now, Blade Splicer, we can get a bunch of extra value off of it with our next couple cards, which is 4 copies of Restoration Angel and 2 copies of Flickerwisp. Both of these cards are doing basically the same thing. They're going to take something in play and then remove it from play and then bring it back to play. So if we target Blade Splicer, we're going to get another 3/3 Golem token, which is awesome. Also, with Restoration Angel, we can actually use this as a protection card rather than just an offensive card, or rather just a value card, because if our opponent's going to blow something up, so say they're going to blow up the Leonin Arbiter, which is preventing them from searching up the last pieces of Tron, we can actually play Restoration Angel with her flash ability, which means we can play it at instant speed, flicker the Leonin Arbiter, and then they are no longer being targeted by whatever opponent was trying to blow them up with. Or even if we're blocking with something, we can use Restoration Angel again to whatever's blocking, flicker it, and they're no longer blocking it anymore because that is the way the game works. They leave the battlefield, they come back, they don't remember that they were actually blocking. Flickerwisp is also really good, but it can't be used at instant speed, at least not in the budget version of the deck. In the upgraded version of the deck, there's definitely some ways of making Flickerwisp absolutely insane and casting at instant speed. I'll get there in a minute when we actually talk about the upgrades. We're only running 2 Flickerwisp because they are not as good in this build of the deck as they are in the upgraded version of the deck. Now that we know what the Death and Taxes part of this deck actually are, let's talk about our mana base. So we are running 4 copies of Field of Ruin and 4 copies of Ghost Quarter. So Field Ruin is actually an upgrade to this deck recently from Ixalan, which is fantastic. So it'll basically, we pay 2 mana, tap it, sacrifice it, destroy target non-basic land our opponent controls. Each player, that means us and our opponent, search up a basic land and put that card in the battlefield tapped. So for us, we can actually break Field of Ruin, blow up our opponent's stuff. Now we have an Aven Mindcensor in play. We actually get to search up a basic land, no problems, where our opponent is only going 4 deep. And Ghost Quarter, on the other hand, is doing exactly what I explained before, where we get to blow up a land, any land, and then if we have a Leonin Arbiter or an Aven Mindcensor in play, our opponent's going to have just a harder time finding their basic land because they're either going to have to pay mana or they're only going to dig 4 deep. So these are really kind of allowing us to control our opponent by destroying their mana base or really getting rid of stuff we don't want out of their mana base and getting rid of stuff, and they're not going to be able to find replacements for it, which is super funny for us. And the last 2 land cards we have are 2 copies of Sea of the Gate Wreckage and 14 Plains. Sea of the Gate Wreckage is really just a draw engine for us. It allows us to pay 2 and a colorless, tap it, draw a card. We can only activate this ability if we have no cards in hand, which ideally in our deck we are aiming to just dump our hand onto the table almost as fast as humanly possible. So once we get to late game, this is going to help us get an extra card specifically on our opponent's turn, because if we do have a Spirit of the Labyrinth in play, we may not be able to draw the extra card off this. So we can just do it on our opponent's turn, which is going to give us a little bit extra card advantage, especially because this is a land card, which is absolutely fantastic for us. And that is the entire deck. Let's talk about our sideboard now. We have 2 copies of Brenton, Forge Tender, and 2 copies of Core Firewalker. One of the decks that do give us a lot of problems is Burn, because we don't have really a lot of ways of stopping Burn decks. So we have a couple cards that are going to actually help us against those matchups. Forge Tender is a cheap spell that has protection from red, so we can actually block any of those creatures they have coming at us. And Core Firewalker is whenever our opponent plays a red spell, we get to gain 1 life, so we get to offset their burning ability. Ideally, these are the 2 cards we're going to side in against Burn, but again, Burn is not a very good matchup for Death and Taxes because we are generally taxing what they're doing, and they're basically just burning our face off, which is not really needing to be taxed. Turns out you can't tax fire because fire doesn't want to be taxed, it turns out. Okay, anyways, the next 2 cards we have is 2 copies of Dusk/Dawn and 2 copies of Sunlance. This is if we're going up against some specific creature decks, we can just kind of wipe the battlefield with all creatures. And the nice thing about Dusk/Dawn is almost all of our creatures have less than 3 power, so we can just blow away the entire board and usually are not very affected by it. The Dawn side of this card is also pretty good for us because it is return all creatures with power 2 or less from your graveyard to your hand. So if our opponent is destroying a bunch of our cards, we can actually get most of them back to our hand because most of our creatures have power 2 or less, except for a couple ones that have 3 power, which for the most part, they all have power 2. And Sunlance is really just a lightning bolt for creatures, non-white creatures. It's helping us out with some matchups where we just need to get rid of specific specific creatures, you'll know when you run up against them, it's actually a really good card in those specific matchups. And the last thing on our sideboard, we have 4 copies of Sundering Growth and 3 copies of Tormod's Crypt. Again, getting into graveyards is always really handy, so Tormod's Crypt is a really good way of doing that for us, and Sundering Growth is just destroy target artifact or enchantment and populate. We're running Sundering Growth specifically because it also has populate, which is we get to choose a token that is on the battlefield and create a copy of it. So if we have a clue token, or if we have one of our 3/3 golem tokens, we can just create another one and then hopefully accelerate ourselves into winning the game. So it has a little bit of a small amount of upside if we actually are playing this card. And that is the entire deck. We're going to move over to the upgrade section now, but I'm going to do it a little bit differently than normal. Because this deck can be upgraded into a top 8 deck, into a really competitive deck, I'm actually going to go through all of the changes and stuff I would take out and stuff I would put in to get us to that top 8 deck. To start out with, we're going to take out all 4 copies of Spirit of the Labyrinth, and we're going to put in 2 copies of Mirren Crusader, 1 copy of Selfless Spirit, and a single copy of Weathered Wayfinder. These 3 cards are just adding to a little bit more variety to the deck, which we actually need when we start getting into the more competitive range. Selfless Spirit is going to prevent our stuff from dying, because if our opponent has a board wipe, we really need a way of protecting everything, because we're eventually going to get a whole bunch of stuff onto the table, and we're going to be slowly grinding in for damage, because this is really a control deck. Selfless Spirit is going to potentially allow us to stop everything from dying on our side of the table. Weathered Wayfinder is a really, really good card when we're going to be destroying our own lands to destroy our opponent's lands, because we can actually get extra lands and kind of become matching, like, 1-for-1 when it comes to lands with our opponent, so it's actually really good. I've actually seen this run as a 2 of in some decks, but I think 1 of it's probably all we really need. Mirren Crusader, on the other hand, is really good against a ton of matchups in the meta, because it has protection from black and protection from green and double strike, so it deals the damage first and then deals damage again. So we're talking about things like Death Shadow, we're talking about Tarmogoyfs, we're talking about a lot of really big green creatures where we can just chump block it and it prevents the damage for days. So Mirren Crusader is just really good actually in the current meta. The second thing we're going to do is take out 2 copies of Vryn Wingmare, so we're going to take all of them out, and 2 copies of Aven Mindcensor, and we're going to be putting in 4 copies of Thalia, Guardian of Thraben. She is absolutely awesome. She's actually the better version of Wingmare, and I know she is legendary, which normally you'd be like, well, we don't want to run 4 legendary creatures, but we absolutely want to see her every single game. There's no question about it, because, again, we're going to be slowing down everything that is not creatures, and our deck is almost entirely creatures, so we're going to potentially handicap our opponent's deck really badly by getting her into play. She also has First Strike, so if we're swinging against anything that is 2 toughness or less, we're going to immediately kill it before it even decides to do any damage to us, which is absolutely fantastic. The next big upgrade is we're going to be adding in 4 copies of Aether Vial and another 2 Flickerwisps, so we have all 4 of our Flickerwisps. We're going to be taking out our 4 copies of Dryad Militant with this, and 2 Plains, because we actually don't need as many lands as soon as we start playing Aether Vial. So Aether Vial is a really special card, because it allows us to cast creatures for free at instant speed whenever we want to, assuming it's been in play for a couple turns, because at the beginning of our upkeep, we get to put a charge counter on Aether Vial. We may or may not do this, so obviously we want to do it, usually we want to do it up to 3, and then we may tap Aether Vial and put a creature with converted mana cost equal to the number of charge counters on Aether Vial from our hand into the battlefield. So why is this important? Well, for starters, we can play any creature out of our hand for free on our opponent's turn. So this is super duper powerful, because if our opponent decides they're going to swing in and do something, or our opponent decides he's going to crack a land to go and fetch something, we can just throw in an Aven Mindcensor or throw in a Leonin Arbiter, and now they can't just go and free fetch up a bunch of stuff, because they're going to have to be paying for it, which is super duper annoying for our opponent, which is kind of the idea of our deck. Additionally, and this is actually one of the most important things about this deck once we get to the top 8 slot, is Aether Vial and Flickerwisp actually have an extremely strong combo together, because we can basically flash in our Flickerwisp at any time to protect anything on the table or prevent our opponent from swinging in. So if our opponent decides they're going to swing in with a big Eldrazi or swing in with something big, we can then flash in our Flickerwisp and then make it so that creature like leaves play and then comes back at the next end step. Additionally, if our opponent is say gonna path exile something on our table or destroy something on our side, we can also use Flickerwisp to prevent that thing from dying, which is super duper relevant and super duper important, because it basically makes it so we can protect anything on the table or get rid of almost anything on the table. If you're playing against Tron, again, you can use your Aether Vial to flash in your Flickerwisp at the beginning of your opponent's upkeep, getting rid of one of their lands, and then you no longer have Tron anymore, which is super duper relevant. So these are things to think about. Aether Vial, Flickerwisp combo is extremely powerful in this deck. Additionally, Aether Vial just getting in free stuff as well, extremely powerful. This is the best upgrade if you're going to make this deck. Please get Aether Vials right away. They are expensive, I know, but they are extremely good in this deck. And the last upgrade, at least in the main board, is we're going to be removing 2 planes and taking out a single Sea Gate Wreckage, and we're going to be putting in 2 Horizon Canopy and a single Ganjo Castle. So Horizon Canopy gives us some extra card draw if we want late game, which is kind of nice, and a Ganjo Castle is giving us protection for our Thalia specifically, because we can tap it and a white mana and prevent the next 2 damage that we dealt to target legendary creature. Specifically, we are looking at preventing Thalia from dying, so it's just giving us a slight edge. It is a very good card, and we can also just go and fetch it up with Weathered Wayfinder if we have Weathered Wayfinder in play. So this is very good. Keep in mind, these cards are quite expensive, so which is why we don't have them in the budget version, but why they are very good in the non-budget version. And again, the entire sideboard is changing because we're not budget anymore, so we can actually get some good cards. So we're running 2 copies of Breton Forge Tender. This is helping us with Burn. Dusk to Dawn helping us creature decks. Graph Digger's Cage is helping us with most graveyard decks, so Dredge, Storm, a bunch of other blue-black decks out there. Kati War's Wager is helping us deal with affinity decks. Core Firewalker is helping us out with Burn again. Mirror Crusader, if we gotta run up against some black-green decks, we can help put that in there. Phyrexian Revoker is helping us deal with a couple specific cards out there. You'll have to figure them out as you go. Ratchet Bomb, again, lots of creatures, a bunch of other things. Rest in Peace, again, graveyard stuff. And then Stony Silence, again, dealing with Artifact Hate, specifically in the Tron dimension over here. And that is the entire deck. Until next time, my name is Adrian, this is Giant Monster Games, and don't forget to game like a giant monster. Thanks for watching the videos here on Giant Monster Games. If you want to support the channel directly, we now have a Patreon page which you can go and become part of the broader Giant Monster Games community. Additionally, if you want to see some other awesome videos, you can click right here or right here.